On a cool November night in 1985, Johnny Carson stepped onto the familiar stage of The Tonight Show at NBC Burbank, greeted by the glow of studio lights, the hush of 300 audience members, and millions watching from home. Yet something was different. His practiced ease faltered as his gaze fixed on a small girl in the front row, dwarfed by a blue dress too large for her frame, a man's wristwatch slipping down her arm, and a folded note clenched in her hand like a lifeline. Moments earlier, she had whispered something to him, and now the man who had mastered laughter for decades stood silent, cue cards trembling, tears forming as the band stilled and the control room urged him to speak. The child's story unfolded in fragments as Johnny knelt before her, his voice gentle, learning that her father, an ordinary working man, had loved this show more than anything, watching it nightly to escape a hard life, sharing jokes at the dinner table, believing laughter was proof that pain could be endured. Those front row seats, won in a burst of improbable luck, were meant to be their shared dream, but fate intervened, leaving one seat empty and a daughter determined to finish what her father began. When Johnny unfolded the letter she offered, the studio seemed to shrink around him as the words revealed a bond stretching back decades, a confession that Johnny's humor had once saved a grieving boy, teaching him to smile through loss. And that same boy, now a dying father, wanted his daughter to learn that lesson too. The host's composure finally broke. Tears streamed freely as he understood the weight of what he'd unknowingly given. Not just entertainment, but survival. Holding the girl's hands, Johnny spoke softly about how laughter doesn't erase sorrow, but carries us through it, then placed his own pocket square into her palms as a promise that joy, once shared, never disappears. The audience rose in a unified ovation, strangers linked by empathy, while Johnny reminded them that those we love never truly leave. They simply find new ways to reach us. And in that moment, late-night television became something timeless, a quiet testament to how kindness, humor, and a single voice can echo through generations. After the applause faded and the cameras cut to commercial, Johnny Carson didn't retreat backstage as usual, but instead guided the little girl and her mother behind the curtain, his hand resting reassuringly on the child's shoulder, where the hum of the studio softened into a quiet, almost reverent calm. Backstage, Johnny moved with none of his on-air polish, crouching to eye level again as he spoke to her by name, telling her that her father's words had reminded him why he'd walked onto that stage night after night, not for fame or habit, but for the chance, however small, to make life feel lighter for someone he'd never meet. He promised her that the empty seat beside her father's dream would never truly be empty again, because every laugh that followed would carry his memory forward. And then he placed a signed photograph into her mother's trembling hands, inscribed with gratitude rather than celebrity. In the weeks that followed, viewers sensed something had changed. Johnny's jokes carried a gentler edge, his pauses lingered longer, and each year, on one quiet night, he slipped a subtle dedication into his monologue that only a few would ever notice, honoring a man in the audience who once believed laughter could save a life. For the girl, those moments became an invisible thread running through her childhood, reminding her that grief and joy could coexist, that loss did not erase meaning, and that even the smallest voice could reach the largest stage. Decades later, As she shared that story with others learning to live through their own pain, the lesson endured just as Johnny had lived it. Humor is not denial, but defiance, a way of standing up to sorrow and saying, "We will keep going." Smiling not because the hurt is gone, but because love remains. Years passed, and the girl grew into a woman who carried that night with her like a compass, guiding her choices through college halls, quiet apartments, and moments when grief resurfaced without warning, yet always accompanied by the memory of a man on a stage who had shown her that sorrow could be met with grace. Johnny Carson continued hosting The Tonight Show for years after, but those close to him noticed how often he spoke of that evening, recalling the child by name, and the letter that reminded him laughter was not a performance, but a responsibility. When Johnny finally retired, he sent one last message through the show, a gentle nod to the idea that humor mattered most when life felt unbearable. And though he never said the story aloud, its influence lingered in his words. When news of Johnny's passing reached the woman years later, she sat quietly with her own child beside her and felt the same ache she'd known as a 7-year-old, tempered now by gratitude rather than loss, and she wrote a letter of her own, thanking the man who had honored her father's dream without ever meeting him. The reply that came weeks later carried a simple truth. Johnny had never forgotten that night, because it reminded him that every joke landed somewhere far deeper than applause. Today, she keeps the watch that once slid down her wrist, the photograph signed backstage, and the folded letter preserved like a map back to hope. And when her daughter asks why laughter matters, she tells her about a quiet moment on a bright stage where a host listened, a father was remembered, and a promise was made without words. And in telling it, she passes on the same lesson Johnny once lived by, that even when the lights dim and the show ends, kindness has a way of echoing, reaching hearts long after the curtain falls. As time moved forward, the story quietly multiplied its impact in ways no ratings chart could measure, because the woman found that whenever she shared that night with grieving families, faces softened and shoulders eased, as if the memory itself carried permission to breathe again. She became a counselor not by accident, but by instinct, drawn to children who felt the same hollow ache she once carried. And she would tell them about Johnny Carson not as a legend, but as a listener who stopped a show to honor a promise, explaining that healing often begins when someone truly hears you. Each birthday, she and her daughter made a small ritual of watching old Tonight Show clips, listening for the gentle rhythm of Johnny's voice, pausing when a joke seemed to linger just a little longer, and imagining a quiet dedication woven invisibly into the laughter. The pocket square, carefully framed, remained untouched, yet its presence filled the room with reassurance, a reminder that compassion can be passed hand to hand like a fragile treasure. As her daughter grew older, she began to understand that the night Johnny Carson cried wasn't about sadness alone, but about connection, about how one man's humor traveled through decades to reach a father, then a daughter, then countless others who needed proof that joy could survive loss. And so the story lived on, not as a viral moment or a piece of television history, but as a shared inheritance retold softly, shaping how one family and many others chose to face the world. Because in the end, the greatest legacy Johnny left behind wasn't a monologue or a punchline, but the quiet understanding that laughter when offered with sincerity, can become a lifeline, stretching farther than we ever expect, carrying love forward long after the lights fade and the applause is gone. In the years that followed, the woman came to see that the night on The Tonight Show had become a living thing, resurfacing in unexpected places, in a child's first laugh after weeks of silence, in a parent's relief when grief finally loosened its grip, in the quiet courage it took to keep showing up. She never spoke of Johnny Carson as a distant celebrity. She spoke of him as someone who paused, who listened, who understood that a few honest words could matter more than a flawless performance. When her daughter grew old enough to ask why people still remembered that moment, she explained that sometimes history isn't made by grand speeches, but by choosing empathy when the world expects you to move on. Johnny's legacy, she told her, lived not only in television archives, but in the countless people who learned, often without realizing it, that laughter could be a form of love. On the anniversary of that taping, she would reread her father's letter, not with sadness anymore, but with a quiet smile, grateful that his voice had reached farther than he ever knew, touching a man who in turn touched millions. And in those moments, she felt certain of one truth. The show never really ended that night. It simply changed shape, continuing wherever someone found the strength to smile through tears. Long after the studio lights dimmed and the curtain fell for the last time, the spirit of that evening endured, carried forward by ordinary people choosing kindness, remembering that even in our most fragile moments, a shared laugh can become a bridge between strangers, between generations, and between loss and hope. Eventually, the woman realized the story no longer belonged only to her or to Johnny Carson, but to everyone who had ever needed a reminder that pain does not cancel joy. Each time she shared it, the memory grew lighter, less about loss and more about connection, about how one moment of compassion on a late-night stage rippled outward through decades. She taught her daughter that laughter is not an escape, but an act of courage, a way of honoring those we miss by continuing to live fully. And so the lesson endured. Even when voices fade and lights go dark, the love we pass along keeps speaking, quietly, faithfully, forever.